So, welcome back, everyone. My name is Irene. I'm an early career fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies at the University of Warwick. And I'm taking over now and chairing the roundtable. What we're going to do now is to have a roundtable with Jessica Adams, who's a PhD student at the University of East London. Arita Bajpeyi, sorry, hope I didn't mispronounce, PhD in Advanced Studies at the University of York, Canada. Sally Payne was like a visual artist and a co-founder of Salt Road. And Joanna Wheeler, who's a Marie Curie research fellow at the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University, and a senior research fellow at the University of Western Cape, South Africa. So the idea of the roundtable would be to discuss together citizenship, what your thoughts are on citizenship, how you relate to this topic for your research, what kind of method you're using. And I would like now to invite you to expand on this with some thoughts or your view on citizenship.
Yeah, I'm a painter, but I've also done a PhD, so I was quite interested in the academic painting comment earlier on. And I felt I was one of the first artists to do a PhD, and then my work got progressively more conceptual, and then I really rejected that when I finished, and decided I wanted to be out in the world a lot more. So, and it was that feeling of being on your shoulder, watching everything you're doing, which I really hated that in the end. So I moved on from that. But I just wanted to say that I've been working around issues around democracy and protest since about 2009, and I've been painting for over 30 years, which is horrifying. But I feel in terms of citizenship and what does that mean to me as a painter, I always take the view that painting is in time, but also outside of time. So there's all the things that are happening in painting today, but I also feel part of the family of painters that are dead, so it's a very alive, even beyond the grave kind of thing. And also that traditionally art and religion and society were totally linked. And it feels kind of really today everything's all divided up, but traditionally it wasn't like that. And I take a lot of comfort from that as a painter. And a couple of years ago, I did a really big project exploring Greenham Common, the anti-nuclear protests that happened in the 80s, went on until the year 2000. And I had a big show in Birmingham, which it was about me as a painter, but I also made a film and had an archive room, and I had lots of engagement artists working across the whole of the MAC, exploring women and protest, which was really amazing. So for instance, one thing that's really come out of that for me was slowing my painting process down, in the sense that one of the reasons why the Greenham protest carried on so long was a relationship with craft and singing, things like that. So I felt that in my own mark making, I became much slower and more grounded, and wanted to create marks that resembled sewing and knitting. And also another key thing in my work is how I use symbolism. And I find that symbolism that could be quite personal, but also quite universal. So I'm aware of I'm only supposed to be speaking for 2 minutes, so all right, carry on. Yeah. For instance, I created this symbol, which is related to a cobweb. Greenham women had the symbol of cobwebs going out, which was about connectivity. For me, this related to crochets and dailies that women sew, but also flowers, but also how we're all connected. So it kind of feels really relevant to citizenship. And I was only invited to this quite late, but this is my symbol of citizenship that I thought of yesterday, which is like a globe, where it's like a globe with a spot in the center, which is like the heart of a person. And then it's a bit like a compass, but instead it has two arms. And it relates to a lot of comments people have been saying about how we're constantly balancing ourselves between different elements. For instance, if we're having a period of a lot of activism, then we're exhausted, so we balance back the other way. And it's also reflective of society. We are in flux, we're always in flux. People are coming and people are going. And if a society is fixed, then it just goes wrong if it's too fixed. So it's about kind of like a globe that moves. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. That was really interesting. And thank you also for creating the symbol, the visualization of what citizenship means for you. Thanks. Arita, for example, like your work is about like performance, history, and memory, right? So I was wondering, how do you see political participation, agency, and how does that intersect with like representation, and particularly with storytelling, right?
Yeah, so I think for me, my form is a classical Indian dance form, and all of the classical forms in India are very sort of wrapped up in the nationalist movement. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So from sort of like the early 20th century onwards, these forms were appropriated from hereditary performing communities and sort of reshaped and reimagined and moved on to different bodies into different spaces to kind of aid in a creation of a national arts and culture heritage. And today that really continues. So classical dancers bear the weight of the nation in many ways. And sort of along with that, there's implications about gender and sexuality, religion, and so citizenship in a lot of ways. And for me, I started learning in Canada. So my sort of encounter with dance has been very much about race as well. So I think for me, what I'm negotiating and where I'm trying to think in terms of performance as well is how can performance occupy space, one, but also sort of negotiate shifting grounds. So in some ways, I'm questioning what citizenship can mean, if it has to be sort of in relation to a single nation, or if we can sort of explode and expand that idea more actively, think about our rights and responsibilities, and how they shift in relation to each other. So for instance, for me as a member of the diaspora, I'm a minority in Canada, but I'm a quite privileged minority as well. I'm a settler. I live on land that has been stolen. Rather, I grew up on land that was stolen, but currently I'm living on treaty land. But I'm also, I come from an upper caste background and quite well-to-do families in India. So my privilege is also part of the reason I was able to kind of grow up here, and my parents were able to come here. And I carry that privilege back with me when I go back to India too. And so all of this sort of informs my encounter with dance as well. So I'm thinking about performance as a means to negotiate all of these. And I think, as Joanna rather beautifully articulated in her video, the layers of citizenship with the layers of performance and the space that kind of opens up for discussion to get audiences to engage with that more actively.
Yes, thanks. Thank you very much. You also mentioned a lot of topics I think we would like to expand on later on together. Thank you very much. Joanna, would you like to follow up on that?
I'm muting my microphone, and I'm sorry if my puppy decides to join the roundtable.
Fine.
Yeah, thanks. It's really interesting. I had prepared something I thought I wanted to say, but now I've completely changed my mind. So listening to you all. And I was thinking about what it is. Someone put a question in the chat during the keynote about the difference between artists and researchers. And then that got me thinking a lot about that and how that relates to what we're doing in citizenship. And I guess I think there's a common assumption maybe in research and thinking about citizenship that if you ask someone a question, they will know the answer. And so if you ask someone, well, what is citizenship? What does it mean? That we can all answer that question. And I guess what I've been trying to work with and what I've been doing is that I don't think it's always possible to answer those questions. And so what is it that we do in research that is about finding different ways of understanding the question or being able to find ways of expressing ourselves. And so that can be through performance and different kinds of art, or through writing, or through lots of different modalities. And I guess that's why for me storytelling is a really interesting kind of practice to have within research. So I'm not studying other people's stories. I'm looking at storytelling itself as a form of inquiry, in which the people that I'm working with are trying to find and explore their own stories. So I'm not telling stories on their behalf. Mm-hmm. And I think that has opened up for me a lot of really interesting theoretical questions about citizenship. But in terms of the actual practice of the storytelling, there is so much that is involved with that that bears thinking about. And I've just moved back to the UK after living in South Africa for 6 years, and I don't know how many of you know very much about South Africa or have been there, or maybe there are even some South Africans on this call. But you know, the issues around privilege and race and different issues around identity are really profound in South Africa, like they are everywhere. And so a lot of what was going on in the research that I was doing through storytelling was about how those things emerge through these different kinds of expression that we were experimenting with. And I think that, maybe what it calls for us to do in academic terms is to question more of our assumptions, which is a little bit where we sort of got to in the keynote talk. And I think it's a really useful thing for me to do, and for us all to do. And I think that is one of the reasons why we need to look, there goes the dog. That's one of the reasons why we need to work with things like storytelling, because nobody knows what the story is going to be when they start out. It's about finding the story in the process, and then what does that look like? It can be anything. So it creates different senses of possibility, and it exposes different kinds of relationships of power.
Yes, thank you. In a way, I think like this investigative approach could be defined somehow in this way. Research-based approach relates also to what Jessica does, like as part of your work, of your research now. So I was wondering, how do you approach the topic of citizenship and political participation in your work? Is it somehow similar to what the experiences we've been hearing so far?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, hi everyone, I'm Jess. I'm a second year PhD student at UEA, the University of East London. So I guess the first thing I just wanted to say is I feel really lucky to be on this panel today. There's much more sort of esteemed and experienced colleagues, so thank you for allowing me to participate. I guess in terms of my understanding of citizenship, I'm not, like Jamie, looking at it explicitly, but I am, I guess, interested in notions of kind of citizen participation. Specifically, as I think many of the other speakers, at the kind of intersection between kind of creative and political participation. And for me personally, I'm looking at what's happening kind of in and around the Labour Party in the UK at the moment. Emphasis kind of on the around, I guess, so not exclusively happening in Labour. I guess one of the things that I think kind of touches on what other people have said is that I'm really interested in a notion of kind of militant research or militant joy, which is around trying to find ways to theorize that don't just focus on kind of critique, but also pick up on kind of weird, sort of transformative and kind of interesting stuff is happening, and kind of really focus on that as a way to kind of operationalize, I guess, the research work that I'm doing. And I guess sort of within that, the sorts of themes that I'm really interested in are around something called transversality and stealth art in particular, which is kind of around crossing boundaries or borders that we've spoken about a little bit, but also a lot around kind of visibility and kind of how things get labelled and described. Another kind of theme that I'm really keen on, which I think fits into this, is ideas of prefiguration, which is a term that comes often from sort of activism, which is the idea of kind of the ends reflecting the means. And within that, I'm really interested in notions of kind of prefigurative kind of labour, I guess. So kind of, as I think my question indicated, sort of breaking down the boundaries between, say, an artist and an academic, or a researcher and a participant, and sort of playing with that. And then I guess the two final things I just wanted to briefly mention is I really like the idea of agonism, which comes from Chantal Mouffe, which is this kind of idea of agreeing to disagree, I think, in its politest way, as kind of a way to kind of negotiate difference. And then the final thing that I just wanted to mention briefly is this idea of kind of radical diplomacy, which was included in the kind of submission that I sent over, which is, I think, a way to sort of, it's a way that a group of academics have found to kind of find spaces for dissent in what is often quite a difficult, and particularly within academia, sometimes, it can be hard to find those spaces. So, yeah.
Following up on some inputs from your statements presentation, I was wondering whether you have more thoughts about potential limits and problems also of this interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary approach. Disclaimer, I come from a very traditional academic background, and I do realize that for me it's very challenging sometimes to interact with other disciplines. And even though sometimes I do that in good faith, I do realize I don't have the tools very often to engage properly, for example, with artists or creative artists and other forms of thinking and reflecting about, for example, communities or agency. So I was wondering, from your experience, what is the potential, what could be the limits, and why creative practices perhaps can say something very specific and unique about that. And this is just very weird to redirect questions. So I don't know, Sally, if you have something as also for your experience, given that you have an academic background and artistical, to start with.
Well, when I'm taking on a big project, I do put my academic hat back on. I mean, I read really widely. And in terms of Greenham, it's I think a lot of the interesting things are coming out now, because people are thinking so much, going much more deeply and analysing what happened. I mean, I'm aware of myself, there is a left brain, right brain thing that it can get difficult, but I really enjoy presenting the academic side and doing a lot of reading. And then it's kind of, I suppose there's a time lag and it comes out the other end. And I've just learned to really trust that creative process, that it kind of balances out in the end. So it's,
It's interesting that you talk about trust, creative process, because it's a very different way of think of preparing the work. As academics, we have a very specific, setup, and we expect that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, my background is in modernist painting, and it's there's also a lot of training about process, which is an emergent, gradual process, and intuition. So I don't see why academic work can't be the same. Mm-hmm. And that's how I approached my PhD, which I did it right at the start of artists doing PhDs. Because initially I did it and I felt that I was copying how an art historian might do it, and then I just thought, well, that's not my voice. There are writings by actual artists, so I kind of had to change how I was approaching it and feel that you can be quite radical and quite wild as well. That at the end of the day, painting is mud, smearing mud. You could say coloured mud. It's how can you embody and make things quite grounded? Mm-hmm. So, but at the same time, there's always a contradiction with me in that, it feels quite privileged that I'm in my studio making work, and I really need that interaction with groups in society. So I, like I'm always working with Salt Road as well on other kinds of projects. But to get ideas, it quite often stems from the time alone in the studio. So that feels like my democratic right. Like for instance, I did a painting called Cross Stitch Through the Dirty Page of History in Greenham, and it was, I did loads of crosses right across, which was about the fence which does cross over. And just before the election got called in 2017, I thought, the cross is really profound. So it is, yeah. So, but the titles are always really important as well.
Yeah, of course. What about, for example, again, this act of trust when it comes to storytelling, for example?
Trust. You mean, well, in a sense, I think, do you mean trust in the self?
Also in others, like, for example, again, in practices of storytelling, you need to trust, I guess, others to tell their own story in their own terms, right?
Yeah.
Without, like, intervening too much, let them speak.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose one example is that recently I was interviewing climate change researchers in Bilbao with Jamie, actually, because I work with Jamie. And in a sense, that was really incredibly profound. And I kind of had some loose, quite creative questions, because the responsibility for us as artists was to find ways of disseminating academic research about the climate, so that ordinary people could understand. So I was kind of asking them, how did they find beauty in their subject? And really, I think we did about 11 interviews, and the whole thing was beautiful in a sense that we were just kind of sat quite close, pulling their answers in a really creative way. So in a sense, that felt like a painting to me. It was about creating, a space of empathy and trust, and getting them to kind of come down from the academic into their life situation, about why they chose to ended up in their subject.
Yeah.
It was, but still a painting.
I feel the element is like part of trust, again, is also part of Joanna's project, right? Joanna's work.
I'll just say a few things about it. I guess we're all talking about research slightly differently in terms of what we mean by what we're doing. So just to kind of explain a little bit the context. So when I'm talking about a storytelling process in research, what I mean is that I've brought together a group of people, or I'm working with a group of people who are telling their own story through a group process. So they have to be able to trust the group itself as well as me, and any of the other facilitators involved. And I think the thing about storytelling, because you don't know where it's going, there's a lot of trust that's involved, because actually people don't even necessarily know what might come out. And people are often surprised by what does come out. And I think when you're working in contexts like the ones that I've been working in South Africa and other places where there's really a lot of deep and overlapping forms of oppression and injustice, everyone is holding huge amounts of trauma. And when you create a space for people to talk about themselves and explore things creatively, sometimes everything comes out. And that, as a researcher coming from social science, and I really identified with what you just said about, you come from a traditional background. We are not trained. I'm not a psychologist. We are not trained to deal with those things ethically. So I think part of the issue about trust is to recognize what it is you're actually asking people to do and what you're doing. And so, how are you as a researcher looking at the boundaries of that process and what that means? So for example, with the storytelling work that I do, I always have a trauma counselor as part of it. And with the possibility for referral afterwards, there has to be some kind of ongoing way for people to engage with that, because otherwise you risk sort of provoking this emotional reaction through story, which then could really be too much for people. to deal with. So I think there's a lot at stake in this kind of work. It's not just a sort of a one-off interaction. It's about how you negotiate trust and risk with the group, and that's it's really complex. And I think that as researchers coming to that, we actually need more training, much more training in how to do that ethically.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that need myself. I'm not trying to speak for everyone. Maybe everyone else is already perfectly happy with it, but I've come across that sort of that difficulty.
There's something else I found really interesting, quite in common in your contributions in your work, and relates to what you just mentioned, Joanna, but also something we mentioned previously in the keynote, and it's the role of emotions. So when we talk about, again, citizenship, political participation, very often there's a sort of rationalist prejudice, as if being guided by emotions will lead us to make wrong choices, right? And there's something bad about working with emotions in politics. It seems like there is a very heavily negative connotation. Something I really like about your work is that it seems that you're trying to offer a positive understanding of emotions, how we can work with emotions, also to rehabilitate emotions when talk about politics and political participation. I was wondering whether you have any thoughts on that. Have you ever considered this dimension as something you reflect on? For example, also like you mentioned Chantal Mouffe. She's one of the scholars that definitely positively look at emotions, which is quite interesting, like the political theory panorama at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I have to say I'm a little bit nervous about emotions, and I think some of it is based on Joanna's kind of point then, and I don't mean I'm nervous about them full stop, but just I'm nervous about talking about them in great depth because I'm not kind of an expert, and as Joanna's point just raised, it's difficult territory, I guess. But I guess, I mean, if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind going back to sort of the previous question around interdisciplinarity, just because I would really like to make a point on that really quickly, which is just that I think that there are lots of huge numbers of challenges in working kind of across different spaces. And a lot of it does come down to sort of training and those sorts of things, but there is also just so much strength, I find, in often going into spaces that are, very kind of have a very distinct kind of language or way of operating, and being the person who can sort of say like, oh, I don't quite understand. Can you kind of explain that in more sort of ordinary language? And often you find, like, I just so often find, particularly in academic spaces, that that's really a really, really beneficial process. It's the same with artists as well, and the same with activists, that I kind of sit across. And, when you really sort of say to people, like, can you just explain that more clearly? You often get to much richer and sort of more interesting discussions. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a neat tie into emotions there, so I'm just leaving it.
No, but definitely I think it's important, there must be some reflection about the language we use. And that's also actually relates to something else I want to ask you. How do you see, how do you work with language? Because when you talk about storytelling, of course, language is an important dimension, but also when we talk about symbols, the way we reappropriate some kind of symbols or concepts, the way we talk about them, can we re-signify some concepts, or can we simplify and make them more accessible, for example? Right.
Sorry, was it for me or is?
It's for was it Holly or Peter, Joanna? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think something that comes up for me thinking about academics versus artists, or what it means to sort of situate your work between those two terms, is really about audience, because academics, you publish an academic book or an article, and it really does only reach a very small number of people, simply because of the way that industry functions, right? The way that you can access academic journals is limited by expensive subscriptions to different journals or databases. Academic books tend to be much more expensive. So like I personally know artists who are looking for this material but are unable to access them most of the time. And I think art that way tends to be a lot more accessible, but it still only reaches a small audience typically, I think, unless it's mass media. So it's an interesting tension that way as well, in that like you think of art as being more easily sort of engaged with, but typically artistic work is either situated in a room, you know, and it's limited to a small audience that maybe there's three shows, or it's a gallery that is in a specific geographic location, and even if things move online, the engagement is still different, I think. So like these are all questions that are important, I think, when we're thinking about citizenship generally, because it's about who can be in the room in so many ways, right? So I think they're related, but that's kind of it's an interesting negotiation. I think there's room for possibilities, exploring that tension and sort of thinking about audience, but I'm not sure what those are yet.
Yes, I guess the question is, can we reach everyone? Ultimately, do we want to reach everyone? Is that possible? And is ultimately desirable?
Yeah, because sometimes you don't want to actually reach everybody, and you're talking to a specific community or a specific sort of social position. Maybe that is common across different cultural or geographic locations. But I guess the question is, who is the work for? And then how do you use sort of your academic or artistic or some combination thereof position to reach those people?
I don't know if Joanna or Sally.
Can I just say something really quickly? I'm not sure whether or not, I don't want to be talking too much or jumping in. It's really hard to know because we're not in a room where we can all see each other. So
yeah,
apologies if I'm stepping over anyone. But yeah, I was just thinking about those 2 points about emotion and how we work with them, and then also about audience. And I guess in the work that I've been doing, I have a very feminist standpoint for the storytelling. And so the audience is deliberately different over time. And in the initial stages of the storytelling process, the audience is the self. So the question is about what story do you want to tell for yourself, and not who else is the story for. And there's no expectation that the story has to go beyond that. And for a lot of people that I work with, that question of what is the story that you want to tell about yourself is very unsettling. And I mean, it would be, if you think about it, you know, it's not an easy thing to do. And yet that sense of being able to control what your own story is also really fundamental to the idea of citizenship, I think. And so I guess in the storytelling process, because the storytelling that I'm talking about it's not about fictional stories, it's about stories of lived experience. There's no disconnect between, or there's less disconnect between emotion, affect, and narrative. So your experience connects all of those things because you lived it. And I guess that in a lot of social science disciplines, we tend to have a much more, we disaggregate those things. We look at them separately. And so in storytelling, those things become muddled together. And I think there's something really important about that, because it allows us to understand complexity rather than, you know, sort of this really violent simplification of things.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm making any sense, but anyway.
I think it makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And then, you know, the idea of where the publics go after that, it is driven by what comes out of the group and where they want to take it, rather than a preconceived idea of what it should do. And I think that is often at odds with the incentives of academia, where we have to write funding proposals where we make all kinds of claims about the impact and, you know, the outcomes and things like that. So it is very difficult to sort of balance those tensions in reality.
Yes, I totally agree. Like also the difference between like this creative process and more broadly, like for example, the academic process. There's some comments. I mean, I've been looking at the chat. Sorry, I have not mentioned that before, but I was looking at the chat where you guys were commenting. I think there was a question coming from Anup Sharma. Sorry, I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name. About marginality and privilege in your lived position experience. That's for Peter, and she is asking if you could problematize this a little bit more when you're in India.
Yeah, sorry, and I think that kind of relates to a question Dawn had asked earlier to Joanna and myself too, thinking about trust. And I think, so to be very honest, I'm kind of in the early stages of negotiating what my dance practice is and how it's related to my academic work in terms of storytelling. I've done a couple of projects, but they've really been very autoethnographic and autobiographical. So myself is kind of at the center of the work that I'm doing right now. So one project I did in India with another Indian Kathak dancer who's based out of Bangalore, and then one I did over here in Toronto. But while I was creating both of these pieces, I was constantly thinking about what would this story mean if I was in my other home. Mm-hmm. So I think when I put myself at the center, I think because of my privilege, I'm always thinking about how it's related to others. I mean, an audience in that sense. And to kind of speak directly to what Anup asked, when I'm in India, I'm very privileged. Less so as a woman, perhaps, but still in terms of my class and caste background, I have a lot of social mobility. And then on top of that, I'm from the diaspora, and that has, sometimes that's not always helpful, but more or less it tends to give me more social capital as well. So when I'm thinking about myself in that context and creating a story, I'm always trying to think through who I might, how my privilege might erase other people. And sorry, thinking through responsible storytelling, I guess. So I'm thinking, and when I do that, I think about my experience in Canada as well. It's interesting too, because here I'm not the most marginalized, but I definitely experienced this feeling of erasure and non-belonging growing up here. So in some ways I'm thinking about my privilege, I'm thinking about experiences of marginalization, and to a degree I'm trusting somewhere that this will speak to somebody. And I'm also working actively to make sure that the way I'm constructing those stories aren't furthering other people's marginalizations. And then I'm hopefully opening up space for my audience, which tends to be of a similar class and in India caste background, to think about where they might also be further marginalizing other people. And I'm not sure if I've been successful in that yet, but that's sort of what I'm thinking through.
Thank you very much. I think that was really interesting. There is a question in the chat. So it's from Maria. So she mentioned your pre-recorded presentation. She said, I really like the idea of rather than trying to change everything, we aim at creating ripples. And she's asking if you can say something more about that and how, from your perspective, we can bring together effectively the micro level of personal engagement and the macro level institutional change. Of course, I guess this question could be readdressed also to Sally, Arita, and Joanna.
Yeah, I can say a little bit. So just the first thing to say is that, quote, ripples and changes in perspective was actually something my boyfriend said. He's participating in the project that I've been running, which is called Choose Your Own Adventure, which is part of my PhD research. So I can't claim that particular quote. I guess something that is maybe an interesting idea to bring in at this point is the idea of cultural democracy. I don't know if this is an idea that's familiar to people.
Perhaps you could say something more about that.
Yeah, okay. So there's it has quite a long history, but a relatively long history. But in the UK, there's a group called the Movement for Cultural Democracy, who came out of a big festival called The World Transformed, which the one that this came out of was, I think, 2017. And essentially what that group are campaigning for is kind of a lot of things, but the main thing is around a redistribution of Arts Council funding. So it's done at a much more local level, and it would be, the funding pot would be sort of decided by local citizens, and done in a way that isn't just about kind of what artists want to do. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about all of this, because it's there's obviously a policy element that's touching on kind of the more macro level stuff, but it's very much bringing it back to kind of local communities. So yeah, they're a really interesting campaign, and I really suggest having a look at what they're doing.
Okay. What about, like, in your work, how do you negotiate between these two? If you want, also the individual dimension and the collective structural one. Do you have thoughts about that? Is it something you have addressed? Sally? I think you're muted.
Yeah. I think you just put on different hats with different groups of people that you're working with, really, because it's interesting interviewing climate change people, because being quite academic. So they found that really curious. It's really, they actually were really blown away by being embodied into our questions. It's quite interesting. But at the same time, I've also done a lot of interviews with Green and Common women, and I spent a lot of time with really ordinary women, or really amazingly, people have done such amazing things. So I think you just got to be really kind of confident and treat everyone the same wherever you go, really. That's how I go about it. It's kind of equality and treat everyone the same, and the joy of that. It's but also I agree there is ripples. You can't do everything. You can do a few things really well. It's quite interesting. Years ago, I was working. Well, I had a curator mentor me for a while. This is going back. It was a few years after I finished my PhD, and I remember being told, "Well, you can't do essays and make paintings. You just can't, because what about us? We're curators and we write essays." So it's really quite interesting. But I think, well, why not? But at the same time, there are so many hours in the day, and you do need to choose. But it's I feel I'm aware as a person that I'm really good at conceiving ideas, but I'm not so good on the mechanisms of making things happen, which is why it's good for me to work with other people who are really good at that. And I really kind of are grateful to that, like Jamie, he's good at that. But it's, in terms of, I remember your comments earlier about symbols. I'm always really blown away by symbols, because I just think when you look back in history, for instance, the peace sign, it kind of like summarizes the whole movement, and it's still really lively today. And it's kind of, we are in a very verbal language seems more important than anything else in our society, I often think. Whereas I feel visuality it's incredibly important, and doing visual-based workshops with people is really relaxing for people, actually. And it's always about presencing and embodying and being grounded. And through these activities, there's always conversations and stories do emerge, and you get the trust through the slowness. So it's
yeah, absolutely. James, are you? There was a
I'm not. If I could just come back to the sort of ripple allegory, the reason I come back on that now is that's actually, that particular metaphor was something that was given back to me as part of the data that I gathered. So the work that I did with Mohammed was, I'm ashamed to say, it began life as an RAF focused impact project, right? So for those of us working in the UK, we'll know what that's all about, right? So it's about finding ways of measuring forms and extents of benefits which have been given to non-academic constituencies off the back of academic work. How has research changed people's lives for the better outside the academy? So one of the things which we did was, particularly the car park event, we had a guy come in from America called Mark Gonzalez, who is both a storyteller, but he also works, he's a research fellow at a number of places in the States. And one of the projects he's works on is called Scaling Empathy. And it's a project that's born out of the perception of the breakdown in not just practices of empathy, but also the cultural value attached to empathy. Empathy is seen as a sort of, as no longer important somehow, as disaster capitalism sort of seems to sort of shape political discourse. You know, you're not meant to worry about what other people think about, because that's a snowflake, lefty, pinko, queer way to think, you know, according to whatever the discourse is, right? And what Mark's work is about finding ways of scaling up small arts events and the effects that they have. So one of the things that he did was he made sure that he had the contact details with ethical permissions of all the participants at our event, and asked them all to stay in touch electronically through various forms of networking, and to make a pledge. And the pledge was something that was manageable within their time, their energies, but it was to go and enact something which would provoke empathy either in their lives or with their professional work and so on and so forth, and then to send that back to us as a kind of narrative in due course. Now, of course, in an entirely self-seeking way, this was manna from heaven for me, because I got these stories coming back in first-person narratives, qualitative narratives of people saying, oh, I tried this in my life, or I tried this at work, and this is what happened. It's rather a tenuous link between my original project and that. But at some point, somebody actually commented on this, not just on the event, but on the process of tracking the nature of the impact that the event had had, and said that actually what we need to do as people who are artists working in communities, possibly with academics, is allow our impact, whether in this narrower UK sense of the word or more generally, to be defined or thought of as a ripple rather than a splash. And I think the splash was the sort of, it's have a big event, get lots of footfall to your event, get lots of media coverage, take a snapshot, because a splash is also a temporal thing. It's quick and it's transitory, and ripples continue, and they continue to transform. So it's about how change is affected through arts and academic and artistic partnerships across time in unpredicted ways, in unpredicted places, and finding ways of tracking that, not just to self-serve so that we get more funding and plaudits as academics and artists, but also because that's a way of really testing how far we reach. So that was just my lived experience from our project with regard to what Jess had spoken about and what others had mentioned with regard to the ripple.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. And I think Joanna has a follow-up on that, something.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something quickly about the story salon, which I mentioned briefly in my films thing that I sent in, but I don't expect everyone would have seen that. But so just to say really quickly what it was. So this, I've done a lot of storytelling work, and in the project I'm doing now, I wanted to move beyond just storytelling with a particular group to look at what happens if you do storytelling deliberately across divides. So pick the most contentious thing, and how do we move through that? Because it just seems to me that so much of politics is, you know, forcing these kinds of binaries, and there's no way to get across those divides. They're just getting bigger and bigger. So I was interested in what happens if you use storytelling with those different groups and then bring them together, and what will happen. So in the process in South Africa, what happened was that the groups together decided to do a story salon, and that was motivated by the idea that you could do and I've done this plenty of times, you can do a screening of the stories. So, you know, you get a space, a theater, or whatever it is, and you invite people and everyone comes and they watch the stories, and there might be a bit of discussion, but you don't really know where that goes. And how much does that necessarily allow people to sort of change their views about people or themselves or their assumptions? It's very unclear. So the groups I was working with, they wanted to try and work with this idea of the dialogue that comes after watching the story. So we had a space, which was the salon, and in South Africa, in townships, people spend a lot of time in the salons, and it's where a lot of news is exchanged and stories are exchanged. But as a privileged white person, I would never be able to go there, because that's not a space that I can go into. And similarly, you know, the salon as a physical space is already segregated in the city. So we created a pop-up salon, and you booked an appointment, and you came and you sat in the salon to listen to someone's story, and then afterwards you sat and talked with them. And it might seem like not a very big deal. I guess in the UK context, that maybe wouldn't be that big a deal. But in South Africa, that's almost impossible to do. Mm-hmm. That you could sit down and listen and have a conversation with someone who is really seen to be on the other side of this position from you. And then it was really, really interesting process. And I wasn't sure if it was going to work. I didn't know if anyone would come. We had so many people. It was like overwhelmed with people. So it was really interesting that by creating that space, it allowed people to step into it in different ways. But I think there's still a lot of questions, which I'm very interested in what you were saying, James, about what happens afterwards and how to trace that. And I would love to know more about that, because I think that's really, really hard to do, and something I'm interested in. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I just realized that it's actually 5:01. So, and we're so aware that it's quite late for those who are like in Australia, for example. So perhaps we're like running out of time at this point. I'd like to remind everyone that actually the contributions of our panelists are available in the website. So if you want, you can look at them. Also, you should be able, yes, Maria just typed the webpage, the link to the webpage. You should be able to access their personal websites in case if they have one. So the idea of the workshop today, the webinar today, was to somehow create a platform and to work from this to perhaps something else in the future. So for this reason, as mentioned before by Jamie, we actually would like to welcome your ideas. If you have thoughts about what we discussed today, we would like to know about that. We would like to know how you think this webinar went also. You can get in touch with us on the website. There is like a contact page. Thanks. Yes, they're linking everything in the chat. So you can get in touch with us there, and we would definitely read your comments. And we would like also to know if you have thoughts about the presentations, the panelists. So the idea is that to keep this conversation going for the future, to perhaps organize something else again soonish. I don't know if Jamie and Maria would like to add anything.
I'd just like to, sorry, Jamie, you go first. Just the word trust has come up quite strongly for me, and so if anyone, as just an invitation, if anyone does want to be part of the participate into a text-based artwork, I'd be really interested to have some framework for that. So if trust in terms of remaking citizenship, anything around trust, if you could send any feelings you have about that in any way you want, shape or form you want, through that contact page that we just put up on the stages.org.uk website, contact us. Then I will then use that to make a piece of artwork which we'll put onto the website in some way as a process. Thank you.
That's awesome. Maria?
I think I just really want to thank everyone so much. It's been so interesting, so inspiring. Thank you for taking the time, and it would be really great if you could follow up on Elena's and Jamie's prompt to just send us anything you might have so that we can maybe actually create an artwork from this and also use it as a way for keeping things going. Because I think we found a lot of overlaps, places where people intersected and sort of were really willing to start a lot of conversations. And it would be really great if we could take this further and maybe have smaller, more themed workshops on some of the themes that came up, for example. So any ideas you have around that would also be most welcome.
Yes, absolutely. And yes, also again, thank you everyone for taking the time, finding the time to be here today. And for our panelists, for our speakers, before James Mohammed had to leave, I think, before, so he's not here anymore, but thank you. Thank you, Jess, Arita, Sally, Joanna. That was really interesting, it was really inspiring, and I think, we have a lot of new ideas to work on now.